In this example, you will learn how to keep data in memory to avoid losing it after calling another object, and then return to the first one. To illustrate the situation, the previous example will continue to be used. Here's a short summary. In the previous video, when values are entered in the filters created for this purpose, the grid is refreshed and will show only the desired data conditioned by these values. Selecting the Update action in one of the rows, as you've seen, will take you to the attraction transaction in Update mode. There, you can edit the values corresponding to the selected attraction. You can choose one of the attractions to modify, for example, the Louvre Museum. We'll change the image corresponding to the attraction photo attribute and select Confirm. Note that this action brings you back to the web panel. The reason is that the work with pattern applied to the attraction transaction has automatically added the return command in order to return to the caller object. This can be seen in the Events section of the attraction transaction programmed within the AfterTRN event. This event is triggered when the transaction has completed a cycle, immediately after the commit operation, that is, after a header has been recorded with the corresponding lines. The return command's function is to end the current execution on this object and return to the caller object. In this example, both the WW Attractions from Scratch web panel and the attraction transaction, i.e., both the calling and the called object, are objects with a graphical interface. So in this case, the return command is the equivalent of invoking the web panel for the first time. It would be different if one of these two objects didn't have a graphical interface, as is the case with a procedure. There, the return command of the object that was called will take you back to the next line right after the invocation. In this case, when returning, the events associated with the web panel loading will be executed. First, the start event, followed by the refresh and then the load events. The latter is executed as many times as there are records in the grid that meet the conditions stated in the conditions property. Since here the conditions don't apply if the variables are empty, at runtime, you'll see that all the attractions are reloaded. So why does this happen? We'll get to that real soon. First, look at the behavior of the web panel created automatically from the Patterns section of the attraction transaction. Filter by attraction name by entering the letter L. There, all the attractions that begin with this letter will be displayed. In this case, the only one that has been entered with this characteristic is the Louvre Museum. Now, select the action to update this attraction. Note that it'll take you directly to the attraction transaction and show you the selected attraction, allowing you to edit it exactly as in the case of the manually implemented web panel. After changing the photo and confirming the update, you'll return to the calling web panel. Note that the filters are kept. This is exactly the feature you need to achieve. Next, a solution will be programmed in the web panel, and the explanation will be provided about the way the pattern does it. Remember that the variables stated in each object can only be used within them as long as the objects are active. For example, in this case, the moment you invoke the attraction transaction from the web panel, your WW Attraction from Scratch object is destroyed, and you get its variables. Therefore, any values that were saved will be lost. On the other hand, the attraction object will take inactive status. Then, when returning from the transaction to the web panel with the return command, the latter object and its variables will be recreated. This is why filter values are no longer displayed. It's actually a new object. Also, the variables used as filters have been created again. The ones existing before invoking the attraction object were destroyed. So this answers the question asked a moment ago, about the reason why the values entered in the filters were not kept after a record was updated. we need to save the information of each one of the filters in a sort of global variables, so that it's not lost between executions, that is, when passing from one object to another. In this case, between the web panel and the transaction, and from the transaction back to the web panel. So, how do you keep the value of a variable in memory? Using GeneXus, you can program this feature using variables of web session type. These variables allow you to handle a group of global variables in which you can store data and access it from any object while the session is active. And this is exactly the purpose of the example. A major advantage of these variables is that they allow you to store a set of data of the key value type. So you only need to create a web session variable and use it to save all the filters you have, each of them with a unique key. In this way, there's a key and a value for the country ID filter, another key and a value for attraction name from, and finally for attraction name to, the three filters that you need to keep between runs of your panel. This meets the need to temporarily save the information entered in the filters to retrieve it later. Let's see how to program this. First of all, we'll create a variable and call it web session. When we give it this name, GeneXus assigns the web session data type, understanding that this is probably what you're interested in, which in this case is correct. If this is not the case, you can always change the data type automatically assigned for the one you want. Then, you'll have to consider when you want this variable to keep the desired values. Remember the main events that are currently scheduled. The start event, which will be executed only once when the page is first loaded. The refresh event, which will be triggered after the start event and every time a filter within the grid conditions is changed or the page is refreshed from the browser. And finally, the load event, which will be executed after the refresh event as many times as data is loaded in the grid. This event will be executed n times because it has a base table associated with it. From these options, clearly the most convenient one would be within the refresh event. Since every time you change any of the filter values, this event will necessarily be triggered, and that's when they would be saved in the session variable so that you can retrieve them when returning from the transaction. But there's also another event, which is the click event of the update variable. The event will be triggered immediately after clicking on the update action. This would also be useful for saving filter values here. It's a good option, since this is the event where we'll invoke the attraction transaction, and, as you've seen, this is the exact moment when the calling object is destroyed, and you get its variables. This is why we need to save the values of the filter variables before doing this. If we do it in the refresh event, we'll save the filter values every time we change data in any of them. Since it's in the grid conditions, every change triggers this event. But this isn't necessary, as you may not need to update the filtered attractions at all in the current run. And in that case, why would you save those filters in the session if the variables are not going to be destroyed? However, if you do it in the event related to the update action, we'll save these values only once, when it's essential to do it, immediately before the object and its variables are destroyed. So this will be done in the click event of the variable. We'll type the web session variable and apply the set method to store values in it. As the first parameter, you need to enter a key, which must be a value of character type, so you must enter it in quotes. In this case, it's called country ID. This unique key will later be useful to recover the value you save. Then we must assign a value to it, which will be the data we want to store in memory. In this case, we'll want to save the value of the country ID variable, which will be the value of the first filter we have on screen. Keep in mind that the entered value must also be of character type. So, as the country ID variable is of numeric type, it must be converted to the character type. This is achieved by applying the toString method to the variable. Let's do the same for the other two filters, attraction name from and attraction name to. Next, the application will be run again, and values will be entered in the filters. Remember that every time the value of one of the filters is changed, the refresh event is triggered, followed by the load event for every record loaded in the grid. Then we'll select the update action of an attraction. At that moment, the event update.click will be triggered, which has been programmed to save the filter values in the web session variable. This is done in order to invoke the attraction transaction later on. As we've seen, it'll be the moment when the web panel object and its variables are destroyed. After changing data in this attraction and confirming it, the return command will be applied. And since in this case, it's the equivalent of calling the web panel object for the first time, the start, refresh, and load events will be run again for each value to be loaded in the grid. Now, we'll need to be able to retrieve these values saved in the web session variable. What do we think would be the best time to retrieve those values? Let's go over the events we have and assess them. In the start event, in the refresh event, in the load event, or in the update.click event. Clearly, the only one that will work for you here will be the start event. As we've seen, this event is executed only once when the web panel is loaded for the first time. When returning from the transaction, it's the equivalent of calling the web panel for the first time, and it's precisely the moment when you need to retrieve those values. In order to assign a key and value to the web session variable, use the set method. Now, you need to know how to retrieve the value stored there. We do this using the get method, in which we must indicate the key of the value to be retrieved. Then, to each variable used as a filter, apply the get method, sending the key corresponding to each one by parameter. This will be done first for the country ID variable, step by step. Enter the country ID variable and assign it the value of the get method of the web session variable, passing the key as a parameter, i.e. in this case, country ID. Remember what has been said before. Web session variables only store data of character type. As the country ID variable is of numeric type, to assign it the value of the web session variable, which will be of character type, we'll have to convert this information into numeric type. This is achieved with the toNumeric method. Next, we'll do the same for the attraction name from and attraction name to variables. We'll run the application again and test its behavior. We filter all the attractions in China between A and M. In this case, only one attraction will be displayed. We select the action to update it, and remember that at that moment, before invoking the transaction, the data of our filter variables will be saved in memory. We change the photo, and then confirm the action. When returning to the web panel, as has been mentioned, the first event that will be executed will be the start event, where we program the retrieval of the information saved in the session variable, assigning those values to our filter variables. Note that now, the values entered in the filters are maintained as desired. In addition, after the start event, the refresh event will have been triggered, which in turn will have triggered the grid loading according to the filters. That's why the grid is filtered again with the modified photo. But once this has been programmed, what will happen when the user first opens this web panel in a browser? In this case, there will be nothing saved and therefore nothing to retrieve. Close any active session on your browser and run the application from GeneXus again for the entire cycle. We'll open the web panel we've created. And since this session is the first time the web panel is run, the first thing that's triggered is the start event. The session variable will look through the entered keys to see if there's any information to retrieve, but there won't be any, as no value has been stored in the web session variable yet. So at this time, the variables used for filters will remain empty. All the attractions are displayed because in the grid conditions, it has been indicated not to apply any filter if these variables are empty. After start, the refresh event will be executed, immediately followed by the load event. Given that the grid has a base table, the load event will be executed n times, as many times as records are loaded in the grid. For example, select to filter by the country France, and we'll see that the grid already applies the filter, showing only the attractions that have France as a country. What the application did after we chose the country filter was to immediately trigger the refresh event. As a result, the load event is triggered, 3 times in this case, because 3 records were found to display with this condition. As attraction name from filter, enter the letter F, and at that moment the refresh event is triggered again, followed by the load event. In this case, the load event will be executed twice, since 2 records meet these conditions and will therefore be loaded in the grid. Finally, in the attraction name to filter, we enter the letter O. The refresh event will be executed again, and then the load event twice. We'll select the update action on the Matisse Museum attraction. At that moment, the update.click event is triggered, in which we program that before invoking the attraction transaction, the data of the filter variables is saved in the web session variable. To this end, the set method of the session variable is used, passing the key and the value that we want to save in a parameter. In this case, there are 3 values to keep in memory. They are the variables country ID, attraction name from, and attraction name to. At this point, the attraction object is invoked and becomes active, and the web panel object is destroyed along with its variables. We change some data of the attraction, for example its photo, and confirm the action. It'll then take us back to the calling object, that is, the web panel. It does this because, as we've seen before, the work with pattern applied to the attraction transaction added the return command within the after TRN event. At this moment, the start, refresh, and load events are executed again for each record to be loaded in the grid. This happens because the return command in this case is the equivalent of invoking the web panel for the first time. The values saved in the session variable will be loaded in the start event. This is done using the get method, passing by parameter the key used to save each value in the event update.click using the set method. This data will be assigned to each corresponding variable, in this case to the 3 variables used for the filters, country ID, attraction name from, and attraction name to. After this, the refresh event will be executed, and then the load event for each record to be loaded in the grid. In this case, there are 2 attractions that meet these conditions and will be loaded in the grid. For this reason, the load event will be executed twice. And what we see on screen is that the values entered in the filters are kept after updating a record. In the next video, we'll see how this functionality is programmed automatically by the work with element of the attraction transaction, comparing it with your solution.